under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. President.
Senator from Iowa.
I'd like to speak in morning business for 1 minute.
Without objection.
An independent judiciary is one of the cornerstones of our democracy. Judges serve lifetime appointments, free from political pressure, so that they can render impartial judgment without fear of retribution. Yesterday, unfortunately, our country took a step in the wrong direction with the Democratic leader's comments. At a microphone in front of the Supreme Court, the Democratic leader harangued and warned Justices Gorsuch and Kavanaugh by name. He said they would, quote, pay a price and, quote again, won't know what hit you if you go forward with these awful decisions, end quote. At best, it was an injection of partisan politics into the process that should be immune to these justices. At worst, it was a threat targeting 2 sitting members of the Supreme Court. Now, either way, I encourage my colleague, the Democratic leader, to apologize to those Supreme Court justices and to do it here on the floor, end of quote.
So, Madam President,
Majority Leader.
I'd planned to spend my remarks today discussing our bipartisan bicameral agreement to fund the fight against the new coronavirus. I was looking forward to congratulating all my colleagues and discussing all the important ways this funding will help our public health experts, frontline healthcare professionals, and state and local officials combat the spread of this virus and mitigate its effects. It's a serious agreement to meet a serious challenge, and today we will send it to President Trump's desk. So today will be an important day for the country, and it was going to be a proud day for the Senate. But instead, the nation's eyes are on this body for an entirely different reason. A few weeks ago, I spoke on this floor about a dangerous trend that threatens our self-government. I explained how some in the Democratic Party appear more interested in attacking the institutions of our government than in working within them. How Democrats increasingly respond to political disappointments with extreme claims that our system of government itself must be broken. The failure can't be their own. It can't be that the left needs better arguments or ideas. No. The fault must lie with the Constitution itself. Democrats have tried to cloak their anger at President Trump in rhetoric about protecting norms and institutions, but in reality, it is their own side of the aisle where anti-institutionalism is rampant. We could talk about attacks on the office of the presidency, on the Electoral College, on the First Amendment, on the Senate itself. But most striking of all have been the shameless efforts to bully our nation's independent judiciary. And yesterday, those efforts took a dangerous and disturbing turn. By now, many already know what the Democratic leader shouted outside the Supreme Court yesterday morning. I'm sorry to have to read it into the record. First, he prompted a crowd of left-wing activists to boo 2 of the associate justices, as though Supreme Court justices were professional athletes, and Senator Schumer were jeering from the stands. And then the senior senator from New York said this: I want to tell you, Gorsuch, I want to tell you, Kavanaugh, you've released the whirlwind, and you will pay the price. You won't know what hit you if you go forward with these awful decisions. End quote. Madam President, I'm not sure where to start. There is nothing to call this except a threat. And there's absolutely no question to whom it was directed. Contrary to what the Democratic leader has since tried to claim, he very, very clearly was not addressing Republican lawmakers or anyone else. He literally directed the statement to the justices by name. And he said, quote, if you go forward with these awful decisions, which could only apply to the court itself. The minority leader of the United States Senate threatened 2 associate justices of the U.S. Supreme Court, period. There's no other way to interpret that. Even worse, the threat was not clearly political or institutional. As I'll discuss in a moment, these kinds of threats are sadly nothing new from Senate Democrats. This was much broader, much broader. The Democratic leader traveled to the workplace of the 2 judges, and in front of a crowd of activists, he told those judges, you will pay the price, right in front of the Supreme Court building. And you won't know what hit you, he said, right in front of the Supreme Court building. If any American had these words shouted at them from a sidewalk outside their office, they would hear those threats as personal. And most likely they would hear them as threatening or inciting violence. That's how any American would interpret those words if they were directed at us. And that's certainly how the press and leading Democrats would have characterized them if President Trump or any senior Republican had said anything remotely similar. We've seen much more hay made out of much less. Perhaps our colleague thinks this is absurd. Perhaps he would like the most generous possible interpretation, that he got carried away and didn't mean what he said. But if he cannot even admit to saying what he said, we certainly cannot know what he meant. At the very best, his comments were astonishingly reckless and completely irresponsible. And clearly, as the Chief Justice stated in a rare and extraordinary rebuke, they were, quote, dangerous, end quote. Because no matter the intention, words carrying the apparent threat of violence can have horrific unintended consequences. In the most recent year on record, Madam President, the United States Marshal Service tracked thousands of threats and inappropriate communications against the judiciary. Thousands of threats against the judiciary. Less than 3 years ago, of course, an unhinged and unstable left-wing activist attempted a mass murder of congressional Republicans at a baseball field right across the river. A Senate leader appearing to threaten or incite violence on the steps of the Supreme Court could literally be a matter of deadly seriousness. So, I fully anticipate our colleague would quickly withdraw his comments and apologize. That's what even reliably liberal legal experts like Lawrence Tribe and Neil Katyal have publicly urged. Instead, our colleague doubled down. Doubled down. He tried to gaslight the entire country and stated that he was actually threatening fellow senators, as though that would be much better. But that's a fiction. And then a few hours later, the Democratic leader tripled down. Instead of taking Chief Justice Roberts' sober and appropriate statement to heart, he lashed out yet again and tried to imply the Chief Justice was biased for doing his job and defending the court. Let me say that again. He tripled down and he lashed out yet again and tried to imply the Chief Justice was biased for doing his job and defending the court. Our colleague, therefore, succeeded in attacking 33% of the Supreme Court in a space of a few hours. Throughout the impeachment and the Senate trial for months, Washington Democrats preached sermons about the separation of powers and respect among equal branches. So much for all of that. And sadly, this attack was not some isolated incident. The left-wing campaign against the federal judiciary did not begin yesterday. Not yesterday. My colleagues will recall that during the impeachment trial, the senior senator from Massachusetts and outside pressure groups tried to attack the Chief Justice sitting right in that chair for staying neutral instead of delivering the outcomes that they wanted. These same groups came to Senator Schumer's defense yesterday with gratuitous attacks against the Chief Justice for condemning the threats against his colleagues. And last summer, a number of Senate Democrats sent an extraordinary brief to the Supreme Court. It threatened to inflict institutional change on the court if it did not rule the way the Democrats wanted. In other words, give us the ruling we want, or we'll change the numbers of the court. Here's what they wrote. The Supreme Court is not well. Really? The Supreme Court is not well. Perhaps the court can heal itself before the public demands it be restructured. Now, what that means is you rule the way we want, or we're going to expand the numbers and change the outcome. A political threat, plain as day. As to read the document, you have expected it to end by saying, that's some nice judicial independence you got over there. It'd be a shame if something happened to it. They couldn't have been more clear. Independence from political passions is the cornerstone of our judiciary in our country. Judicial independence is what enables courts to do justice, even when it is unpopular, to protect constitutional rights, even when powerful interests want them infringed. Judicial independence, Madam President, is what makes the United States of America a republic of laws rather than of men. It's been almost a century since the last time Democrats threatened to pack the Supreme Court because they wanted different rulings. History still judges that disgraceful episode to this day. So I would suggest that my Democratic colleagues spend less time trying to threaten impartial judges and more time coming up with ideas that are actually constitutional. Fortunately, this extraordinary display contains one ironic silver lining. These clumsy efforts to erode a pillar of American governance have just reminded everyone why that pillar is so crucial. These efforts to attack judicial independence remind us that independence is essential. Every time Democrats try to threaten sitting judges, we are reminded exactly why the framers gave them life tenure and salary protection. Precisely why they did it. Every time Democrats toy with packing new seats onto the court, we're reminded exactly why, as Justice Ginsburg recently said, 9 seems to be a good number. Justice Ginsburg said, 9 seems to be a good number. The distinguished men and women of the Supreme Court do not and must not serve at the pleasure of angry partisans. Must not serve at the pleasure of angry partisans. They do not need to pay any mind to unhinged threats, as shameful as they may be. In fact, as the Chief Justice reminded us yesterday, they are duty-bound to pay such things no attention at all. Their job description is simple: to apply the law to the facts, as the Chief Justice put it, without fear or favor from whatever quarter. I have great confidence the court will do just that. I'm confident that if the facts and the Constitution would have led the court to disappoint Democrats the day before yesterday, they will still feel free to do so today and tomorrow and beyond, notwithstanding these shameful tactics. Now, I had hoped I would not need to reiterate what every Republican senator told the court in August after Senate Democrats sent their threatening brief. But today, I have no choice but to say it again. Republicans are absolutely and unshakably committed to the core constitutional principle of an independent federal judiciary. The core constitutional principle of an independent federal judiciary. As long as this majority holds the gavel, we will never let the minority leader's dangerous views become policy. This majority will ensure the only casualties of this recklessness are the reputations of those who engage in it.
Leadership time is reserved. Morning business is closed. Under the previous order, the Senate will resume consideration of S-2657, which the clerk will report.
Calendar number 357, S-2657, a bill to support innovation in advanced geothermal research and development and for other purposes.
Madam President.
Democratic
Are we in
leader?
a quorum?
We're not.
Thank you, Madam President. Now, Madam President, I just listened to the Republican leader, and there was a glaring omission in his speech. He did not mention what the rally yesterday, my speech, or the case before the court was about: a woman's constitutional right to choose. To the women of America, what we're talking about here, what I am fighting for here, is your right to choose. An issue, of course, Leader McConnell completely ignored in his speech. I feel so passionately about this issue, and I feel so deeply the anger of women all across America about Senate Republicans in the courts working hand in glove to take down Roe v. Wade. I just read about a woman in Shreveport who, under the Louisiana law, now before the Supreme Court, would have to travel over 300 miles to exercise her constitutional freedoms. And this is happening in states across the country. Republican state legislatures are restricting a woman's right to choose so severely as to make it non-existent. And the courts are now likely to go along because Senate Republicans have confirmed nominees they believe will strip away a woman's rights and fundamentally change this country, going so far as to deny a duly elected president the right to pick a Supreme Court justice. Republicans are afraid here in the Senate to confront this issue directly, so they try to accomplish through the courts what they'd never accomplish in the court of public opinion, and they leave women out in the cold. So yes, I am angry. The women of America are angry. And yes, we will continue to fight for a woman's right to choose. I will continue to fight for the women of America. Now, I should not have used the words I used yesterday. They didn't come out the way I intended to. My point was that there would be political consequences for President Trump and Senate Republicans if the Supreme Court, with the newly confirmed justices, stripped away a woman's right to choose. Of course, I didn't intend to suggest anything other than political and public opinion consequences for the Supreme Court, and it is a gross distortion to imply otherwise. I'm from Brooklyn. We speak in strong language. I shouldn't have used the words I did, but in no way was I making a threat. I never would do such a thing. And Leader McConnell knows that. And Republicans who are busy manufacturing outrage over these comments know that too. Now, what will remain long after the clamor over my comments dies down is the issue at hand: a woman's constitutional right to choose and Republican attempts to invalidate it. The fact that my Republican colleagues have worked systematically over the course of decades to install the judicial infrastructure to take down Roe v. Wade and do very real damage to the country and to the American way of life. That is the issue that will remain. And I owe an obligation to the women of America to fight for their constitutional rights. I yield the floor.
Democratic Whip.
Madam President, I come to the floor this morning as a Senate colleague who may know Chuck Schumer better than most. We lived under the same roof for almost 20 years. We know one another. We know each other's families. We've been together through moments of sadness and triumph. I know him well, and I come to the floor this morning to make this statement. I respect Chief Justice John Roberts. but I respectfully disagree with the statement he made yesterday about Senator Schumer's comments before the Supreme Court building. It is not in Chuck Schumer's nature to physically threaten anyone, or to create a dangerous situation for any person. That is just not Chuck Schumer. Even his passion, as you just heard, about the issue of women's health care would not lead him to that position. Yes, as he said, he could have chosen his words more carefully, but is there a person in public life who's ever stood in this chamber or any other who wouldn't say the same about some public utterance? What troubles me is that he is being admonished publicly by President Donald Trump for his use of words. Being admonished by President Trump for his use of words. It just takes your breath away to think that this president, with his thousands of tweets and statements and utterances, outrageous as they've been, would be standing as a judge of others when it comes to the use of language. And I listened carefully this morning as Senator McConnell, the Republican leader, came to the floor and spoke. When he talked about his singular respect for the Supreme Court and judicial independence. He used the phrase repeatedly, judicial independence. He called the judiciary, rightly, a pillar of the American government. Does Senator McConnell think we have forgotten what he did when it came to this same Supreme Court after Justice Scalia passed away? He intentionally left a vacancy on the court for almost a year before it was filled for political purposes. We remember when President Obama, in the last year of his presidency, offered the nomination of Merrick Garland, a highly respected circuit court judge in the District of Columbia. Do you remember what this Republican leader, Senator McConnell, did in response? This man who so admires this pillar of the American government, the judiciary, he refused to even personally meet with Merrick Garland, President Obama's nominee. And he instructed his colleagues on the Republican side to do the same, to shun him, to give him the cold shoulder, and to make it clear that for a year there'd be a vacancy on the court because he, Senator McConnell, was praying he would get a political opportunity to fill that vacancy if a Republican were elected to the presidency. And of course, that's what happened in 2016. So for Senator McConnell to come before us and talk about his respect for the court, keeping politics out of the court, calling it a pillar of the American government, has he forgotten what he did to Merrick Garland? And incidentally, despite his constitutional contortion, that for some reason in the last year of a presidency, that president has given up any constitutional right to fill a vacancy. Senator McConnell was recently asked, well, what if that happens in the last year of President Trump's administration? Well, he wasted no time saying, of course I would let President Trump fill the vacancy. As transparent as possible, his partisan motives when it comes to that Supreme Court. So if he wants to show respect for the court, it certainly has not been demonstrated, starting with the vacancy of Justice Scalia. And how about his single-minded effort, Senator McConnell's single-minded effort to fill every federal vacancy across the United States as quickly as possible, sadly, with men and women who scarcely have any experience in service in our judicial system. So far, President Trump has sent to this Senate, and Senator McConnell has accepted and approved 9 nominees for federal judiciary who have been found unanimously unqualified by the American Bar Association. 9 men and women who have such extreme backgrounds or such limited experience, they shouldn't sit on the federal bench, but Senator McConnell, with his respect for the judiciary, couldn't wait to give them lifetime appointments. Oh, you ask, wait a minute, what about President Obama? How many did he send to this Senate who were found unanimously unqualified by the American Bar Association? None. None. Not one. That is what we're facing here with Senator McConnell's singular strategy to fill the courts with people who share his extreme views on women's health care, on civil rights, and on so many other fundamental issues. So preaching on this floor about your respect for the Supreme Court, your respect for our federal judiciary, doesn't go very far when you take a close look at the record that Senator McConnell has written. So at this point, let me suggest that we move forward from this day and not dwell on what the morning headlines might be. We have work to do. And it would be better if we did it in a bipartisan fashion with respect for one another. I stand ready to work with those on the other side of the aisle to achieve that goal. But I want to say at this moment that dwelling on this particular chapter doesn't serve the American people. They didn't send us here to squabble and fight. They sent us here to pass important legislation that respects their right to quality, accessible, affordable health care. They sent us here to make sure that women have the basic constitutional right to make the most important personal decisions of their lives. They sent us here to make sure that we serve this country in giving working families a fighting chance. All of the other things that we spend time talking about on this floor diminish in comparison. It's time for us to roll up our sleeves and let the Senate be more than a rubber stamp for the federal judiciary when there are partisan goals in mind by Senator McConnell and others. Madam President, I yield the floor. Suggest quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.
Madam President.
Majority Whip.
Madam President, are we in a quorum call?
We are.
I would ask unanimous consent that the quorum call be lifted.
That objection.
Madam President, as I begin this morning, I want to associate myself with the remarks of the Republican leader, Senator McConnell, earlier this morning. The attacks that were made by the Democratic leader, Senator Schumer, on the Supreme Court yesterday were not only irresponsible, they were reckless, and they were shameful. And I think we need to just call that what it is. And for them to suggest, or him to suggest, that this isn't what he meant and that this is somehow manufactured outrage on the part of us or Republicans in general, doesn't fit with the way that these comments came across either, because I want to read for you from the CNN Supreme Court reporter, and I quote, "Schumer, speaking at a rally of abortion rights supporters, appeared to threaten Kavanaugh and Gorsuch, President Trump's two Supreme Court nominees who were confirmed after bruising nomination fights." That's the interpretation not of Fox News, but of CNN. And I think we need to be very clear when comments like that are made that threaten an independent judiciary in this country. They need to be called out and they need to be walked back. And I appreciate the fact that the Democratic leader acknowledged today that he should have said it differently, but it doesn't in any way diminish what was said or the context in which it was said, or the attacks that were made on the Supreme Court. It needs to be recognized as that. And I think all of us need to be, as United States senators, aware, no matter what the audience, particularly when you're the Democratic leader, of how these things come across and what they mean to the people who have been threatened by them. Madam President, I'm pleased that Republicans and Democrats in both chambers have quickly come together to provide emergency funding to combat the coronavirus. And I look forward to voting this afternoon to send this important funding measure to the President's desk. On another subject, Madam President, our nation is poised for the widespread deployment of the next generation of Internet technology, 5G. With its incredible speed and connectivity, 5G will usher in a new era of innovation. Advances in medical care, the large-scale deployment of precision agriculture, safer transportation technologies, 5G will bring all of these things and more. But like a greater number of connected devices, the risks with 5G will be greater. That's why an essential part of deploying 5G networks has to be looking at how we can mitigate security risks. Yesterday, the Senate Commerce Committee, of which I'm a member, held a hearing on supply chain risks for 5G. We need to ensure that the component parts of our devices, and critically, the component number of steps to prevent equipment from Huawei and another suspect Chinese company, ZTE, from being used in U.S. communications networks. But these companies still pose a risk to the United States. For starters, some U.S. broadband providers, often in rural areas, still have equipment from Huawei and ZTE in their communications networks. And a number of our allies and trade partners, entities with whom we regularly share information, including sensitive national security information, have used or are using technology from Huawei and ZTE. Yesterday's Commerce Committee hearing focused on both of these issues. We discussed so-called rip and replace, an initiative already underway to replace suspect telecommunications components with hardware from trusted companies. Last week, the Senate unanimously passed the Secure and Trusted Communications Networks Act, which is now with the President to be signed into law. This legislation will help telecommunications providers with the cost of replacing network components that pose a security risk. I co-sponsored this legislation, which was developed by Commerce Committee Chairman Roger Wicker. Madam President, cost is a major obstacle for small broadband providers when it comes to replacing telecommunications hardware. But as one expert witness at the hearing noted, a lack of qualified telecommunications workers also poses a barrier to replacement. I recently introduced legislation, the Telecommunications Skilled Workforce Act, to help increase the number of workers on the front lines of replacing this equipment and deploying new secure 5G networks. I hope, Madam President, this legislation will quickly make its way through the Senate. Replacing problematic hardware in our domestic telecommunications networks will help ensure the security of our communications for years to come. As I said earlier, that's not the only challenge that we're facing. We regularly exchange information, including sensitive national security information, with our allies and trading partners. And this information can only be secure if networks on both ends are secure. That's why the United States has called for other countries to reject telecommunications technology from Huawei and ZTE. While some countries have committed to using trusted companies to build out their telecommunications networks, other countries are still planning to make use of Huawei's technology. That's why I'm introducing legislation today to make telecommunication security a key objective when negotiating future trade deals. This legislation is critical as the United States begins formal trade talks with the United Kingdom and with other allies. We should be using trade agreements to push for enhanced network security globally, which would benefit not only our country, but every country with which we do business. As one witness noted at yesterday's hearing, this legislation is, and I quote, is long overdue, and I could not agree more. Madam President, over the past few years, we've talked a lot about the importance of having the United States win the global race to 5G. There are important reasons for that. For starters, having the United States at the forefront of 5G technology will mean big benefits for our economy and for American workers. But there are also important security reasons to have the United States at the head of the 5G revolution. If we lead the world in implementing 5G, we will have the chance to set standards for 5G deployment, including, most importantly, network security standards. It is no exaggeration to say that having the chance to set worldwide standards for 5G is critical. It's critical, Madam President, to our national security. Our telecommunications networks already play a huge role in our national security, and that role will only grow as we fully adopt 5G technology. We need to ensure that U.S. networks are as secure as it is possible for them to be. Madam President, I appreciated the witnesses who took the time to address the Commerce Committee yesterday. There is no better way to learn what needs to be done for 5G security than to hear from the people on the ground who spend every waking day managing network security issues. And I look forward to continuing to work with all of my colleagues in the Senate to advance telecommunication security and ensure that the United States is fully prepared for the 5G future. Madam President, I yield the floor, and I suggest the absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.
Mr. President,
Senator from South Carolina.
I'd ask unanimous consent to terminate the quorum call.
Without objection.
Thank you very much. Later in the day, I will be making a motion to table the Paul amendment that would require offsetting the $7.76 billion for the coronavirus against the foreign operations account. Senator Paul's at it again. He's consistent. I respect his view. I just reject it. What he would be doing is basically upending the FY 2020 agreement on foreign assistance spending passed by Congress and signed into law by President Trump. He would be putting our nation at risk if this amendment actually passed. 1% of the things we have that I think are national defense oriented. The U.S. Global Leadership Coalition, consisting of 500 businesses, NGOs, military, and faith leaders, have warned that cuts of this magnitude would have devastating consequences on our ability to confront unprecedented global program, warned in an AP article that I'd like to make part of the record if I could at this time.
Without objection.
He says that the coronavirus continues to create panic around the world, and there's an economic downturn. I've been telling European leaders and leaders around the world, you don't have enough money set aside to address the needs in Africa, East Africa, West Africa, in the Middle East right now. We're only beginning to understand the cost associated with the virus. I want to compliment Senator Shelby and Leahy for putting this package together, compliment the White House and the Senate and House. It was a huge vote in the House. If we accept Senator Paul's offset amendment, it will be devastating our ability as a nation to deal with this matter overseas. And as to Senator Paul's worldview, I have consistently rejected it. When it comes to international terrorism, I have no desire to go back to the pre-9/11 footprint of where we ignore problems over there, hoping they won't come here. And when it comes to fighting disease and containing viruses, I think we understand that we have to be present over there in an effective way to control the spread of the coronavirus, Ebola, and other diseases that can make their way to America. So we've always rejected these type offsets by Senator Paul. I think the best thing we could do is have an overwhelming bipartisan vote. You know, count me in for dealing with the deficit. But this is a penny wise and a pound foolish, because this $7.76 billion, if it's taken out of the foreign operations account, it makes this country less safe on multiple fronts. And I will be making a motion to table at the appropriate time and urge my colleagues to understand that what happens over there matters to us over here. And this would devastate programs like the Benjamin Gilman International Scholarships, Berea College and Western Kentucky University participate in. There's just a ripple effect of enormous proportions. And it's not going to do much for the debt, but it will do a lot to make us less safe. Senator Leahy.
Mr. President, just my friend and colleagues on the floor, I totally agree with what he just said. Senator Shelby and I will be giving longer statements in a few minutes, but Senator Graham and I have had the duty, really, to put through the foreign operations bill for a number of years now. We've tried to do it in a bipartisan, I'd say actually a nonpartisan way, and as a result, it has gotten very, very strong support from both sides of the aisle, which is what we hope will happen now. I will certainly be voting with Senator Graham's motion to table when he makes it. Every senator, right, he or she can vote any way they want. But I would note for our colleagues, Senator Shelby and I and key senators, including the senator now on the floor of this, and I in both parties, have worked every day, every evening, our staff's weekends, and all to get where we are. This is a product of every single Republican, every single Democrat who wanted a voice in this, a chance to speak to it. Both Senator Shelby as chairman, myself as vice chairman, we made sure their voices were heard. I yield the floor to just.
I would like to just compliment again you and Senator Shelby. You know, always deliver. You seem to be able to do things that other people can't do at a time when we need you to deliver for the body and the country. And I've got an article, UN Food Aid Chief Fears for Africa, Mideast amid new crisis. I'd like to introduce that into the record. Is that good?
Without objection.
And a U.S. Global Leadership Coalition letter.
Objection.
And I just wrap up in saying that Senator Paul is consistent. Every time he wants to pay for something, he comes to the foreign assistance account. And I understand, you know, the argument, why are we spending over there when we got problems here? That sounds good until you realize how the world is. On September the 10th, 2001, the day before 9/11, we didn't have one soldier in Afghanistan, not an embassy, not an ambassador, not a dime of aid. The Taliban were in charge, and they gave al-Qaeda safe haven, and that's where the planning of the attacks in 9/11 originated. Looking back, wouldn't it have been nice to have some influence in Afghanistan on September the 10th? So all I can say, I'll never go back to that pre-9/11 mindset of ignoring the world, because I've learned, like most Americans, the world can come here in a very bad way or a very good way, depending on how we defend ourselves. And this 1% of the budget, foreign assistance to deal with problems over there, is absolutely essential in terms of global health. He exempted the global health component of the foreign assistance account, but the money, 7.76, will destroy other things in the account that I think are vital to our public health here and our national security and our alliances. You cannot fight problems like this by yourself. You need partners. You need to get involved over there so the virus doesn't spread any more here than necessary. So I hope that people will listen to what Senator Leahy just said, that this was a negotiated agreement. We all came together to get a budget. Senator Shelby and Leahy did a wonderful job working with the House and the White House to get us to where we are today. This amendment would upset everything, and I'm going to move to table it at the appropriate time. And with that, I'll notice the absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.
Let me see if they want us to call. Mr. President,
Senator from Maryland.
I would ask that the quorum call be dispensed with.
Without objection, under the previous order, the Senate will proceed to the consideration of House Resolution 6074, HR Resolutions, HR 6074, which the clerk will report.
H.R. 6074, an act making emergency supplemental appropriations for the fiscal year ending September 30th, 2020, and for other purposes.
Mr. President.
Senator from Maryland.
First, Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that floor privileges be granted to Michael Thomas, a member of my staff, for the remainder of the 116th Congress.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. President. At the end of fiscal year 2021, the 5-year authorization for the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, our nation's foundational pre-kindergarten through 12th grade law, is due to expire. While I understand that previous reauthorizations took 13 years and allowed an entire generation of students to matriculate through school system around our nation, I'm here today to stress that our kids cannot wait for the needed transformational changes to our nation's federal, state, and local education policies and additional funding investments. To provide a stronger federal partnership to states and local communities that have worked together to support transformational change that will ensure educational equity and quality for all public school students, I introduced the True Equity Act. It stands for the Transformational Reform and Updates to Ensure Educational Quality and Urgent Investments in Today's Youth Act. My home state of Maryland has been long recognized as having one of the best public school systems in the country, according to the independent newspaper Education Week. This ranges from having an entire county-based local school system ranked as near the top in the nation to individual schools producing national leaders in academic achievement. In addition, Maryland was one of the first states to offer half-day preschool for 4-year-olds, has broad access to advanced placement courses for high schoolers, and pays for dual enrollment courses for high school students at our local community colleges. I am proud of these accomplishments. However, not all of our students have found success. In the 2016, the Maryland General Assembly and Governor of Maryland established the Maryland Commission on Innovation and Excellence in Education, chaired by the former Chancellor of the University System of Maryland, William Britt Kerwin, to identify the policies and practices so that Maryland schools perform at a level at the world's highest performing school systems. The Commission was charged with a number of tasks, including a review of the current funding formulas and accountability measures utilized to ensure educational equity and quality, how Maryland schools prepare students for post-secondary education and the workforce, and to make recommendations for the state on needed funding improvements across the state and local school districts. These reviews are necessary to support growing populations of children with disabilities, how to improve and expand programs supporting post-secondary credential attainment, and other policy changes to address the academic achievement gap that has persisted along racial, ethnic, and income levels between students of color and low-income students compared to the higher income and white peers. To meet this expansive charge, the Commission included stakeholders from across our state, including representatives of the Maryland General Assembly, including our now Speaker of the House of Delegates and our now State Senate President, the Governor's Office, county elected leaders, educational leaders, including state and local school board representatives, our state and local superintendents, leader of our state public university system, teachers, business leaders, and leading educational advocacy organizations such as the Maryland State Education Association, the Maryland Parent Teachers Association, and Maryland Family Network. In addition to the members of the Commission actively sought input from the public with numerous meetings soliciting public comment held across our state. In January 2019, the Commission unanimously released their interim report that found Maryland students scored in the middle of the pack on the National Assessment of Educational Progress, known as the nation's report card, that is given to representative samples in the 4th, 8th, and 12th graders in every state. The gaps in achievement between socioeconomic, racial, and children with disabilities were far too large in a state like Maryland that has committed resources and established policies that are meant to provide a world-class public education system. The Commission also reported that less than half of the kindergartens entering our school system ready to learn, and fewer than 40% of the students are graduating from high school truly college or career ready. This is in spite of the estimates that by 2022, nearly 2/3 of the jobs in Maryland will require at least a post-secondary credentials, whether they be nationally recognized industry certificates or a 2- or 4-year college degree. For instance, in 2017, just under half of all students across Maryland high schools received a proficiency score in their English 10 exam. That exam helps evaluate a student's readiness for college or career. This integrated data shows that continued struggles to close academic achievement gaps among racial and socioeconomic groups. Along racial lines, 77% of Asian students, 67% of white students were proficient. However, only 34% of Hispanic students and 29% of African American students earned proficiency scores. The Commission's interim report highlighted that despite Maryland being ranked as being one of the top 5 states with the highest household median income, our large number of Maryland students are living in poverty. 43% of Maryland students are low income or eligible for free or reduced price school meals, meaning that they come from families at or below 185% of the federal poverty line. For every 10 public schools across our state, there's a concentration of poverty where enrollment consists of at least 55% of students living in poverty. These schools are in all of our subdivisions except one. In 15% of Maryland schools, at least 80% of the children are low income. Students attending school with a concentration of poverty receive less funding per pupil than other school districts. For example, 53% of African American students attend schools with concentration of poverty, while only 8% of white students attend these schools. The academic achievement gap between Maryland students with means and our low-income students is stark. On the English 10 exam, 62% of economically advantaged students earned a passing score, while 28% of those that are on free and reduced price students were deemed proficient. These statistics are stark. We know we have a problem. We have to deal with it. The Commission reported that these academic achievement disparities continue into college enrollment, with fewer students of color and low-income students enrolling in college than their higher income and white peers. We will find similar numbers throughout our nation. We need to do something about this. Concerns about the state of education in Maryland was not limited to student performance. The Commission's interim report also found that students face a rotating carousel of teachers throughout their time in schools. With the average salary for teachers in Maryland approximately 25% less than professionals with comparable levels of education, it's difficult to attract to the profession. 60% of our new teachers are recruited from outside our state each year. This is a common problem we have throughout the country. Once those individuals arrive in the classroom, 47% will leave by the start of their 3rd year. The turnover is tremendous. It's salary issues, it's working conditions. It makes it difficult to get the true professionalism and commitments that we need in education. This difficulty in recruiting individuals and constant churn leaves Maryland students and local education systems facing shortages in critical need areas such as special education, language, and the STEM fields. In order to address these inequities in education, the Commission unanimously agreed on a proposal for 5 transformative policy recommendations in their interim report that would provide significant additional investments in federal, state, and local funding and modify policies for Maryland's pre-kindergarten through 12 education system. The 5 main policy recommendations would first invest in high-quality early childhood education and care through a significant expansion of full-day preschool to be free for all low-income 3- and 4-year-olds so that children have the opportunity to begin kindergarten ready to learn. Second, it invests in teachers and school leaders by elevating the standard and status of teaching profession, including a performance-based career ladder and salaries comparable to other fields with similar educational requirements. Third, it creates a world-class instructional system with an international benchmark curriculum that enables most students to achieve college or career-ready status by the 10th grade and then pursue pathways that include early college, advanced placement courses, or a rigorous technical education leading to industry-recognized credentials and higher-paid jobs. Fourth, it provides support to students that need it the most, with broad and sustained support for schools serving high concentrations of poverty, with after-school and summer academic programs, and student access to needed health and social services. And finally, it ensures excellence for all through an accountability oversight board that has the authority to ensure that transformative education system recommendations are successfully implemented and produce the desired improvements in student achievement. These reforms will be implemented over a 10-year period, creating a sustained and coordinated effort to transform Maryland's public education system into a world-class system, elevating the teaching profession and eliminating educational inequities. An independent analysis conducted in November 2019 confirms that the cost to implement the Commission's recommendation will pay for themselves shortly after the 10-year implementation period. Last year, the Maryland General Assembly recognized that our children cannot wait to implement the Commission's recommendation and established the blueprint for Maryland's future to lay the groundwork for the implementation of the Commission's recommendation. Starting this year, the blueprint for Maryland's future is assessing low-income families' access to expanded services in early childhood education, including free pre-kindergarten for 3- and 4-year-olds from low-income families. The blueprint for Maryland's future is assisting in the recruitment of new teachers to the profession through increased teacher pay and career ladders for existing teachers to help train the next generation. A newly established career readiness standard will allow Maryland high school students to succeed in dual enrollment courses offered by local community colleges. The blueprint stresses Maryland's education formulas to better target resources to students who need additional assistance, including children with disability, English learners, and students in school with high concentration of poverty. This is all done while increasing accountability to ensure that the additional investments are properly implemented and help our students succeed. That's the path that we're on. I agree with advocates and our elected leaders that understand our kids cannot wait for adoption of these recommendations at some point in the future. We need to act now. We need to implement these recommendations now and view them as a national model for other states to aspire to. Without transformative change, we will continue to hope for significantly different results with only incremental changes, or we can be bold and change the future of our children in our country and every child with the high-quality education skills training that they need to be successful and climb out of poverty. I reject the arguments from those who would claim that the recommendations are too costly to implement. Without the full implementation of the Commission's recommendation, we are failing in our primary goal in government of providing better future for our children, allowing them to slip behind their national and international peers. These arguments also failed to recognize that the investments in our children can lead to a lifetime of reduced cost in public safety and health care costs as children can grow and support themselves and their future families through education they received in public schools. These investments will pay back dividends in a stronger economy that will benefit all of us. I believe that we should not allow states and local communities to make these transformative changes on their own. The federal government should be a strong federal partner in ensuring accountability and addressing educational inequities for our children. That is why I introduced the True Equity Act. This legislation, purposely modeled after the Commission's recommendation, establishes 4 new supplemental federal grant opportunities for state and local school districts committed to addressing educational inequities while holding states and local school districts accountable for failing to properly support their students. Strengthening the federal government's commitment as a partner in education, the 4 new True Equity grants would provide an additional $1 of federal funds for every $2 of state and local funds committed to education beyond their FY 2019 spending levels. State and local school districts receiving a grant will be required to meet a maintenance of effort to ensure that the state and local education spending is maintained and not allow the federal government's funding to backfill reductions in state and local commitments to educational funding. As a requirement to receive one of the 4 new True Equity grants, the state would be required to have an independent oversight board to ensure that the state and local districts are meeting their state-designated educational equity goals and have the ability to hold the state and local school districts accountable for not meeting the targeted goals. These grants are flexible to allow local communities to meet their needs over a several-year period, whether it's through the establishment of a college and career readiness pathway to support high school students' dual enrollment in local community colleges and provide a jump start on college, additional funding to expand the number of early learning hubs in a state. In Maryland, this is known as the Judy Centers, or training for teachers on how to address the needs of our children with disabilities. As Congress begins to look at the next reauthorization of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, I urge my colleagues to listen to the voices of Marylanders across our state who know that our kids can't wait for the implementation of these recommendations and support the True Equity Act. I congratulate members of the Commission who thoughtfully researched and crafted this national model for states to be able to see transformative change and raise their education system to that of a world-class school system. We owe our children nothing less than providing them the best possible outcome in our nation's public schools. Mr. President, I would suggest the absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll. Mr. Alexander.
Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that we dispense with the quorum call.
Without objection.
Mr. President, I call up my amendment number 1506 and ask that it be reported by number.
Clerk will report.
The senator from Kentucky, Mr. Paul, proposes an amendment numbered 1506.
Mr. President, my amendment would pay for the emergency funds for the coronavirus. I think that we should not let fear or urgency cause us to lose our minds and cause us to act in an irresponsible fashion. I, for one, have looked at foreign aid over the years as welfare that we send to other countries that really is not particularly in our best interest anyway. If you follow foreign aid through the years, what you find is that it goes from middle-class folks in rich countries to rich people in poor countries. Frankly, people enrich themselves at our expense. They steal our money. The Mubarak family now is worth billions of dollars in Egypt that they have skimmed off the top. The history of this throughout the third world is legion and is well known. My amendment would basically say that we would take the $8 billion from the welfare we give to foreign countries and we would pay for this. I see no reason why we shouldn't do this. I'm not opposed to the emergency funding, but I think the emergency funding should be gotten from elsewhere in the budget, and that's a responsible way to act. Every day, people across the country confront unexpected expenses. We budget, we plan, but things happen. When they do, we adjust and plan accordingly. And sometimes we confront an expense that is not only unexpected, but urgent. That's where we find ourselves today. We want to respond and make sure we are providing resources to our medical professionals and researchers. That's important, and I fully support that, which is why we should use this moment to ask ourselves at a moment like this whether it's really necessary to keep spending on wasteful things. If we don't consider this now, when will we ever consider this? We want an all-hands-on-deck response, so we should be cutting out waste and moving those resources into something that's of more immediate concern. So if the coronavirus is of immediate concern, and I think it is, let's address that situation now, but let's do so by taking money from less urgent things and taking money that we are wasting overseas, taking money that is often stolen by third world dictators. That's exactly what I'm proposing today. We have the money. We don't need to borrow more money. We just have to start setting our own priorities. For example, we shouldn't spend another dollar developing a foreign economy this year. That spending should be stopped, and the money should be spent here to buy supplies, to help expedite research, and to support our communities. The funds I'm proposing to keep at home have been used abroad for all kinds of unnecessary and wasteful things. I'll give you a few examples. We send U.S. taxpayer dollars to fund kids from Pakistan to go to space camp in America. We spend money combating student truancy in the Philippines. We've been funding the Peruvian Green New Deal. We actually send money to help deported illegal immigrants start up businesses in El Salvador. What business is it of the U.S. taxpayer to be funding small business in El Salvador by people who broke the law trying to break into our country? It's insane. I think this money would be better spent at this point in time on research on coronavirus and response to this epidemic should it become worse in our country. The list doesn't stop there. I don't know why we can't agree to spend this money on a coronavirus instead of spending it abroad. We spend over $50 billion a year in Afghanistan, building their roads, building their schools, trying to create a nation where there really is no nation. We need to spend that money here at home. Besides, it's the law. We have a law called PAYGO, or Pay As You Go, which is supposed to require Congress to pay for new spending. It's been around for a couple of decades, and yet we've broken the law thousands of times. What do? They see something they want. You know, they're a kid in the candy store, and they want to spend, they want to give you free money, and so they just ignore the law. So what happens, every year they exceed the pay-as-you-go, they don't do the thing they're supposed to do, which is offset this with a spending cut, and they just write a small little note in there saying, we've agreed to ignore the PAYGO rules again. That's what will happen in this case. The other way they ignore the rules on PAYGO is they declare things an emergency, so everything's an emergency. And the thing is, well, you say, well, what would we do if we didn't have this, if it weren't an emergency? Well, we already spend billions of dollars and have spent billions of dollars over years preparing for epidemics. We fund the CDC, we fund the NIH. There's a lot of money out there. But once again, I'm not against giving additional money, but we should just make a decision. We should be mature people and say, oh, we're just not going to print up the money or borrow it from China. We're going to take it maybe from something less necessary. When we don't want to pay for new spending, we just simply waive these rules on pay-go. We declare the spending to be emergency, and they get around the requirement. That's how we got a $23 trillion debt. We actually borrow $2 million every minute. And people say, well, we got to do something. People are running around crazy. We got to do something. Well, who's going to do something about the $23 trillion debt? Do we not have 5 minutes to take a vote? In 15 minutes, we'll be taking this vote, and people could simply vote and say, we're not going to borrow more money. We will take the money from somewhere else in the budget that is less pressing. But mark my words, there's no fiscal responsibility up here among either party. It will be a small minority of us who will say that this funding should be offset by taking it from somewhere else in the budget. In times of emergency, Congress scrambles to put together new spending, but we should be working just as hard to pay for the cost that comes with emergencies. Which is a higher priority, spending millions of dollars to stabilize the supply chain of medical supplies and treatments here at home, or spending millions on international arts festivals? Which is a higher priority, spending millions to train frontline medical professionals here at home on how to limit exposure to the coronavirus, or spending millions of dollars, if not billions of dollars, paving roads in Afghanistan? My amendment gives us a chance to set priorities. We can support our communities and give our medical system the resources it needs, and we can do it without adding to the debt. That's the responsible way. My amendment would do exactly that, and I encourage other senators to consider fiscal responsibility. Thank you, Mr. President.
Senator from Vermont.
Mr. President, I would hope, and I know other senators have already spoken on this, but I would hope members would oppose the Paul amendment. The amendment would cut, among other things, $7.3 billion from the Department of State and USAID. It decimate programs that fund the foreign policy priorities of both the administration and the Congress. A cut of that size is about 2/3 of the total funding appropriated for these purposes, some of which has already been spent. I remember when Secretary Mattis, James Mattis, was Secretary of Defense, a man I admired from his work as with the Marine Corps as a 4-star general, and also as Defense Secretary. He was not a man who looked at the world or the needs of our military in an abstract fashion. He dealt with it every day. He came before our Appropriations Committee and he said, if you want to cut foreign aid, buy me more bullets. He made it very clear that there are areas in the world where what we do keeps us from having to go into combat. The Paul Amendment would practically eliminate the remaining budget for programs to strengthen democracy, combat corruption, promote economic growth, improve water and sanitation, aid victims of war and natural disasters, and support our allies and partners in countless ways. The funding for the programs that would be cut by the Paul Amendment is how we make our presence felt around the world. It actually totals less than 1% of the federal budget. Senators of both parties voted overwhelmingly to include this funding in the fiscal year 2020 State Foreign Operations Appropriations Bill. And in case anybody's forgotten when that was just 3 months ago. So the coronavirus represents a serious public health threat. We have to respond now. We have to treat this as the emergency it is. And I'd ask unanimous consent that a letter from the U.S. Global Leadership Coalition addressed to Senator Graham and myself. Incidentally, they represent more than 500 U.S. business and non-governmental organizations. A letter they sent to Senator Graham and myself opposing this amendment. I'd ask that that be printed in the record.
Without objection.
And, Mr. President, I know that, again, Senator Shelby and I'll be speaking further on this. I'd ask my whole statement be placed in the record as though read.
Without objection.
And with that, Mr. President, I do not see another senator seeking recognition, so I suggest the absence of a quorum.
The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.
Mr. President,
Senator from South Carolina.
I ask unanimous consent to terminate the quorum call.
Without objection.
I ask unanimous consent that all debate time be considered expired.
Without objection.
I move to table the Paul amendment and ask for the yeas and nays.
Is there sufficient second? Senator Graham, there appears to be. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander. Ms. Baldwin. Mr. Graham. Thank you. Mr. Barrasso. Mr. Bennett. Mrs. Blackburn. Mr. Blumenthal. I got you. Thank you. Mr. Bennett. Oh, Mr. Blunt, Mr. Booker, Mr. Bozeman, Mr. Braun, Mr. Brown, Mr. Burr, Ms. Cantwell, Mrs. Capito, Mr. Cardin, Mr. Carper, Mr. Casey, Mr. Cassidy, Ms. Collins, Mr. Coons, Mr. Cornyn, Ms. Cortez Masto, Mr. Cotton, Mr. Kramer, Mr. Crapo, Mr. Cruz, Mr. Daines, Ms. Duckworth, Mr. Durbin, Mr. Enzi, Ms. Ernst, Mrs. Feinstein, Mrs. Fisher, Mr. Gardner, Mrs. Gillibrand, Mr. Graham, Mr. Grassley, Ms. Harris, Ms. Hassan, Mr. Hawley, Mr. Heinrich, Ms. Hirono, Mr. Hoven, Mrs. Hyde-Smith, Mr. Inhofe, Mr. Johnson, Mr. Jones, Mr. Kane, Mr. Kennedy, Mr. King, Ms. Klobuchar, Mr. Langford, Mr. Leahy, Mr. Lee, Mrs. Loeffler, Mr. Manchin, Mr. Markey, Mr. McConnell, Ms. McSally, Mr. Menendez, Mr. Merkley, Mr. Moran, Ms. Murkowski, Mr. Murphy, Mrs. Murray, Mr. Paul. Got you. Mr. Perdue, Mr. Peters, Mr. Portman. Yeah, thank you. Mr. Reed, Mr. Risch, Mr. Roberts, Mr. Romney, Ms. Rosen, Mr. Rounds, Mr. Rubio, Mr. Sanders, Mr. Sass, Mr. Schatz, Mr. Schumer, Mr. Scott of Florida, Mr. Scott of South Carolina, Mrs. Shaheen, Mr. Shelby, Ms. Sinema, Ms. Smith, Ms. Stabenow, Mr. Sullivan, Mr. Tester, Mr. Thune, Mr. Tillis, Mr. Toomey, Mr. Udall, Mr. Van Hollen, Mr. Warner, Ms. Warren, Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wyden, Mr. Young, Baldwin, Barrasso, Brown, Capito, Cardin, Casey, Coons, Cotton, Graham, Kane, Leahy, Menendez, Peters, Rosen, Schatz, Scott of Florida, Sinema, Tillis, Udall, and Whitehouse. Senators voting in the negative: Lankford, Paul, and Perdue. Mrs. Fisher, aye. Ms. McSally, aye. Mr. Heinrich, aye. Mr. Young, aye. Mr. Kramer, aye. Mrs. Blackburn, no. Mr. Cruz, no. Mr. Braun, no. Ms. Ernst, no. Mr. Young, no. Mr. Lee, no. Mr. Gardner, aye. Mr. Blunt, aye. Mrs. Murray, aye. Ms. Hirono, aye. Mr. Murphy, aye. Mr. Rounds, aye. Mr. Hawley, aye. Mrs. Loeffler, no. Ms. Murkowski, aye. Mr. Jones, aye. Ms. Collins, aye. Mr. Moran, aye. Mr. Inhofe, aye. Mr. Kennedy, no. Mr. Reed, aye. Mr. Sass, aye. Mr. Shelby, aye. Mrs. Shaheen, aye. Mr. Blumenthal, aye. Mr. Rubio, aye. Mr. Booker, aye. Mr. Johnson, no. Mrs. Hyde-Smith, aye. Mr. Thune, aye. Ms. Duckworth, aye. Mr. Durbin, aye. Mr. Warner, aye. Mr. Cassidy, aye. Mr. Tester, aye. Mr. Wyden, aye. Mr. Portman, aye. Mr. Romney, aye. Mr. Roberts, aye. Mr. Grassley, Mr. Grassley, aye. Mr. Merkley, aye. Mr. Hoven, aye. Mr. Toomey, no. What is it? It's a special. Ms. Harris, aye. Mr. Bozeman, aye. Ms. Cantwell, aye. Mr. Schumer, aye. Ms. Stabenow, aye. Mrs. Feinstein, aye. Mr. Risch, no. Mr. Crapo, no. Ms. Hassan, aye. Ms. Smith, aye. Mr. Van Hollen, aye. Mr. Cornyn, aye. Mr. Scott of South Carolina, aye. Mr. Manchin, aye. Mr. Burr, aye. Mr. King, aye. Mr. Carper, aye. Mr. Bennett, aye. Mr. Daines, no. Mr. Young, aye. Mrs. Gillibrand, aye. Ms. Klobuchar, aye. Mr. Sullivan, no. Ms. Cortez Masto, aye. Mr. McConnell. Aye. Mr. Wicker. Aye.
Are there any senators in the chamber wishing to vote or wishing to change their vote? Seeing none, the ayes are 80, the nays are 16, and the motion is agreed to. Under the previous order, the time until 1:45 shall be equally divided between the leaders or their designees. The Senate will be in order.
Madam President.
The Senate will be in order. Please take your conversations out. The Senate will be in order. We have a senator wishing to speak. The Senate will be in order. The senator from Washington.
Thank you, Madam President. I come to the floor to speak about the ongoing crisis of the novel coronavirus outbreak and to urge all of us to pass this supplemental as quickly as possible. As of this morning, there are 163 confirmed cases in 17 states across the country, but no state has been more hard hit than the state of Washington. We now have 39 confirmed cases of COVID-19 and more than 230 people under public health monitoring. We have lost 10 of our citizens, and our thoughts and prayers are with those families who've lost loved ones, or still families who have those in a nursing home that they are trying to make sure get the appropriate care in this ongoing crisis. I'd also like to thank the workers who are on the front lines of this healthcare crisis, who are doing everything they can to help keep our citizens safe. What's clear in this supplemental is that we need more resources for testing, that testing capabilities will help our communities understand the community transfer of this virus and what else we need to do to help stop its spread. Some of the funding in this supplemental can be helpful for our smaller public labs to do more testing, to help our public health officials respond to this crisis, and as I've urged yesterday, for the CDC and others to make it clear through our public health sites exactly how the public can go about getting access to testing. This is so critical because I know there are people in the state of Washington who feel ill, who feel like they might be subject to this coronavirus and aren't getting tested. We want to make sure that the public clearly understands what their paths are for getting those tests. And we want to make sure that every lab, commercial and academic, in the United States is getting prepared to help us in the advent of the spread of this virus. Why? Because helping to identify these early cases is what will help us be successful in understanding these patterns and further community separations that we need to do. Why is this so important? Well, today in the state of Washington, they are taking major steps. Major employers are encouraging, if possible, their employees to work from home. These are companies like Microsoft and Facebook and Amazon, major employers. We have 23 schools who have closed and 2 school districts who are entirely shut down. Why are they doing this? Because they're taking the precautions of people that have been exposed to the coronavirus in those schools, and they're doing everything they can to make sure that they respond correctly. In addition, King County has recommended that anyone over the age of 60 or anyone with a pre-existing medical condition who is pregnant should avoid public places and gatherings as much as possible. We're taking all these steps now because we are at the epicenter of this crisis. But I want people to know that there are other things that other states can be doing to learn from what we've done in Washington. The fact that we had a flu lab that actually was a collaboration between our academic and scientific and health communities to get people who thought they just simply had the flu to also be tested, we found cases of the coronavirus. That actually is something you have to set up and get permission for. So I hope that every state will follow suit and set up such a cohort of people working together to share that information so that we can help prevent the spread. Washington State will receive $11.5 million in funding to help the Department of Health respond to this crisis. I know the Vice President is visiting our governor in Olympia, Washington today, and I hope that these funds in this bill that we are passing today will increase access for public lab testing, help pay for isolation and quarantine, help pay for sanitizing in public areas, better track the virus and those who might come into contact with it, help labs who are trying to identify hot spots and to limit exposure. As part of this package, Washington State will also be helped by the reimbursements with reimbursements since the outbreak of this cost, and I can tell you they are many, and to help us push through the things that are protocols that will help establish better responses. Yesterday, we had a hearing in the Aviation Subcommittee to talk about what is needed for an aviation protocol. I know that some airlines in our state are doing everything possible to clean planes on every turn of the trip and to do deep cleaning. They're communicating, and we've encouraged them to communicate more to their passengers exactly what they are doing to help in mitigation of this virus. But that is not a substitute for the Department of the Transportation federally and the CDC collaboratively to work in giving guidance to airlines on what standards they should be meeting to help mitigate the spread of this virus. My colleagues and I are calling on them to do that, and not simply to think of this as others' agencies' responsibilities, but work collaboratively to get this done. So I want to thank the Appropriations Committee for getting this legislation to us today and all our colleagues who have worked so quickly on making it happen. But I can tell you, we need these funds, we need them now, and we need other states to heed the early testing that would have been helpful in our state and now may be helpful in yours. Let's get as aggressive about testing as possible. Let's get aggressive about sharing information about flu and tracking this virus. Let's get aggressive about trying to mitigate the impacts of this deadly disease. I thank the President, and I yield the floor.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.
The senator from Iowa.
A new study showed that from
We are in a quorum call.
I'm sorry. I asked that the calling of the quorum be suspended.
Without objection.
A new study showed that from the years 2007 to 2018, prices of actually hundreds of drugs rose many times faster than the rate of inflation. List prices on 602 medicines rose by 159%, or that would average out 9% annually. After discounts and rebates, net prices increased by 60%, or 4.5% annually. That's 3.5 times the rate of inflation. These are drugs for multiple sclerosis, cholesterol, rheumatoid arthritis, chemotherapy, diabetes, and many other debilitating and life-threatening conditions. Put into real terms, these price increases mean that if one of these drugs cost $100 a month in 2007, that same drug would cost $259 in 2018. Now, meanwhile, you got to consider the working American. Wages for the average American over the same time period increased about 30% in the private sector. That means wage growth is about half the rate of the growth of prescription drug prices, even after the rebates and even after the discounts. For many, increased drug costs are wiping out progress that these workers are making in their wages. Some families are even going backward financially after paying for their prescriptions. This doesn't take into account at all the many other increases in the cost of living, from college to housing to insurance. Now, Americans are surely fortunate, aren't we, to see the significant wage growth that we've had in this country for our workers under President Trump. Great progress. The President and Republicans in Congress can rightly take credit for the country's booming economy. But all that wage growth doesn't mean much, or at least as much, if it's spent on the same prescription drug refills every month. That's something that ought to concern every member of this Congress. And for most, I'm sure it does, because we hear about it constantly from our constituents. In fact, polls show during this election season that it's one of the top 3 or 4 issues that are most on people's minds. So let me be clear. These price hikes aren't because the medicines got better or there was a significant increase in research and development. No, this was because the pharmaceutical companies could do it, and doing it, they could get away with it. Because in many cases, consumers don't have choice. Consumers don't have options or alternatives. And that's because we don't have a healthy marketplace that drives costs down for pharmaceuticals. Right now, pharmaceutical companies can essentially charge Medicare whatever they want, and taxpayers don't have much recourse. Right now, every single working American who pays federal taxes is subsidizing Big Pharma's record profits through the drugs that the federal government pays for through various programs like Medicare and Medicaid. Now, there's got to be a solution for this situation, and Ranking Member Wyden and I are working to put some common sense back into this whole system of buying pills. In the Finance Committee, we've passed bipartisan legislation to put an end to unlimited corporate welfare for Big Pharma. The vote of that bill out of committee was 19-9, a bipartisan effort. And we're closer than ever to lowering drug prices for tens of millions of Americans, and these Americans have been crying for this help from Congress for quite a few years. But here we are. Big Pharma and its paid allies are out in force, trying to kill any reforms that might endanger their profit margins. They're using scare tactics, deploying terms like socialism and price controls, just as if these subsidies to the Big Pharma is not a form of socialism. But I've been around long enough to recognize the political games that are being played now. You see it quite regularly on the televisions, advertisements. So let's set the record straight. The last thing Big Pharma wants is a free market. After all, these were the same folks who loved Obamacare so much because they knew it mandated another revenue stream for their products. Now, we all know how Obamacare has turned out, and yet they made a deal with the White House to back that bill. Now, Big Pharma is also warning that any reforms would hurt research and development. In fact, my bipartisan legislation with Senator Wyden would result in less socialism, a more competitive marketplace, and wouldn't put a damper on innovation. And that's according to something that I call God around here, the Independent Congressional Budget Office. These are professional people making these judgments. They judge most all of our legislation, particularly if there's a monetary cost to it. For those who may not believe a politician, let me point out to the work then of the professionals at CBO that they have done on Grassley-Wyden. First, the updated Grassley-Wyden bill will save more than $80 billion and result in no fewer cures. CBO number 2 says it'll reduce patient out-of-pocket spending in Part D of Medicare by around $50 billion. CBO number 3 says it'll reduce premiums by about $1 billion for tens of millions of seniors and Americans with disabilities on Medicare. And CBO says 4, that's all on top of out-of-pocket expenses that we put a cap on and an end to the dreaded donut hole that has been part of Part D since 2003. We've also, according to Congressional Budget Office number 4, we've also created a new way to spread out payments for those out-of-pocket expenses so that paying the bills every month become a bit easier for those on fixed income. And sixth and lastly, according to the Congressional Budget Office, the Bipartisan Prescription Drug Reduction Act, and that's the title of our bill, would protect taxpayers from being put on the hook for unlimited price hikes that have no basis in a functioning free market. So, without reforms, big pharmaceutical companies will continue to receive tens of billions of dollars in excess taxpayer subsidies, and they will also have no incentive to keep prices rising many times faster than inflation. Currently, prescription drug manufacturers can charge Medicare more and more every year, and they do. And when the government's paying and you have entitlement programs, taxpayers are forced to foot the bill. So Grassley-Wyden enacts accountability and ends corporate welfare without harming medical innovations. Now, Senator Wyden and I are looking forward to reintroducing our bipartisan bill very soon. So far, a dozen Senate Republicans have announced publicly that they support this bipartisan bill. Others will announce their support in coming days, and a dozen more Republican senators have indicated to me that Grassley-Wyden is going in the right direction and implying that they'd vote for it on the Senate floor. So I'm optimistic that we'll continue to gain support as senators learn more. I was really pleased with President Trump announcing his willingness to sign a bill in his State of the Union message. The next morning, Vice President Pence was on cable TV saying that he supported Grassley-Wyden. And Senator Azar has endorsed the bill. And not only that, but Senator Azar and a gang of people in domestic policy at the White House has been working with us on this legislation even prior to its coming out of committee. So with all of this work and with all this support, and with its interest on the part of the voter as being one of the 3 or 4 most prominent issues that's going to determine how people vote, it seems to me it deserves a vote on the Senate floor, and very soon. So I'm here today to urge my colleagues on both sides of the aisle, if they have any questions about this bill, to visit with me about it and how it will help all of our constituents. And the 6 points I made about the bill, based upon what the Congressional Budget Office said about it, isn't all that that bill does. There's a lot more to it. So we've all, I've read, maybe I better back up. I've read enough comments of my colleagues, colleagues I haven't even talked to, has said what an important issue this is. So in one way or another, without even signing on to this bill, without even being on the Finance Committee, it seems like we've all pledged to lower prescription drug prices. So I think we should follow through on that pledge. I yield the floor. And I suggest the absence of a quorum.
The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.
Senator from Louisiana.
Thank you, Madam President. I ask unanimous consent that Kyle Wood.
We are in a quorum call.
I'm sorry. I did not know we were in a quorum call. I ask that we suspend the quorum call, Madam President.
Without objection.
And I just wanted for the record you to know that Tony told me we were not in a quorum call.
No comment.
But that's okay. He's allowed one mistake a year. Madam President, I ask unanimous consent that Kyle Wood, an intern in Senator Sullivan's office, be granted full privileges for the remainder of the month.
Without objection.
Thank you, Madam President. Madam President, I have 6 requests for committees to meet during today's session of the Senate. They have the approval of the majority and minority leaders.
Duly noted.
Thank you, Madam President. Madam President, I just want to spend a few minutes talking about a friend of mine from Louisiana who is a fine American and a fine Louisianian, and he is retiring. His name is Ronnie Anderson. I want to celebrate his 51 years of service. That number's correct. I know some of our pages here can't imagine someone being in a single job for 51 years, but Ronnie has served 51 years. And he has devoted those years in large part to service to our state's Farm Bureau. He has led the Louisiana Farm Bureau to greater influence, to growing membership, and that's not a small feat because America was born on a farm. In some respects, Louisiana was born on a farm, and farming is as you well know, Madam President, is a challenging yet a very rewarding vocation and profession. For 31 of the last 31 elections, the Louisiana Farm Bureau members